Welcome back to Fundamentals of Philosophy. In this lecture, we're going to take a closer look at the three main readings from the context book for Module 1, with an eye towards the topics included on our upcoming discussion and quiz. There's also going to be questions related to these topics on your midterm exam, which is coming up at the end of week 3, so you're going to want to look out for those as well. And we're going to try to cover all of that stuff in this lecture. So, philosophical thinking. In our first reading, Monroe and Elizabeth Beardsley provide us with a systematic framework for understanding what philosophy is and what philosophers do, by establishing working definitions for three key concepts: philosophical beliefs, philosophical questions, and philosophical thinking. We typically go about our daily lives guided by a number of what they call ordinary beliefs. For example, we generally believe that criminals should be held responsible for their actions. We believe that democracy is preferable to dictatorship, I think. We believe that our experiences of the world match up with something like an objective reality. And these beliefs orient us and inform our actions and judgments about the world, the way we interact with the world in countless practical ways. But these ordinary beliefs that we have about the world, they don't exist in isolation. They just don't emerge out of nowhere, right? Looking closer, we discover that each of these ordinary beliefs is anchored by a deeper and often implicit assumption or set of assumptions that are simultaneously more general and more fundamental. So more general and more fundamental beliefs stand underneath these ordinary beliefs. So consider our belief in criminal responsibility. This ordinary belief presupposes a more general and fundamental assumption that human beings possess free will and can genuinely choose between alternative actions. This concept of free will applies far beyond the criminal justice system, touching every domain of human choice and action. So in the Beardsley sense, it's both more general, it's wider in application, and it's more fundamental. It's more conceptually foundational than our ordinary beliefs about criminal responsibility. Because, we believe if someone's going to be punished for a crime, then they should have had a choice to do otherwise, right? That if they never had a choice to not do the crime, then what sense does it make to punish them for doing the crime? So there's an underlying network, a bedrock of belief that has to already exist, has to already be in place to structure these ordinary beliefs. And these underlying assumptions that implicitly ground our ordinary beliefs, that underlie them, are what the Beardsleys call philosophical beliefs. So that's how they're going to divide this up: philosophical beliefs and ordinary beliefs. Our ordinary beliefs are our practical daily beliefs that allow us to sort of navigate through the world successfully. But underneath these are the more general and fundamental philosophical beliefs, which structure and give context and inform these ordinary beliefs. These ordinary beliefs are based on them, and if you investigate them, inquire into them closely enough, you'll begin to see how they rely on these other fundamental and general philosophical beliefs. So, such beliefs often operate beneath the level of conscious awareness. They structure our entire worldview, often without us even realizing it. We don't necessarily, when we see a news report about someone going to jail for committing a crime, our first thought isn't, well, this raises interesting questions about free will versus determinism and whether they had an alternative choice that was logically. These are in the background. This is invisible background stuff that resides underneath our decision-making, our conscious decision-making. A lot of it comes to us through culture, through history, through the time and place we happen to live. Some of it's just the type of organism that we are, the type of creature we are, that also structures the way we think. But if we start interrogating these normal everyday beliefs, we're going to find out that there are layers and layers and layers of belief underneath them that they depend on, this whole web of belief. The philosophical project begins with uncovering these implicit assumptions. That's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get underneath our ordinary beliefs and find out what are the philosophical beliefs that underlie them, that underwrite them, that justify them. And this is going to involve a process of systematically interrogating our justifications for holding our ordinary beliefs? Why? What reasons can we give? What arguments can we give for holding seemingly ordinary beliefs, stuff that you normally wouldn't even think about questioning? When we ask whether we have good reasons for our beliefs, whether our beliefs form a coherent system, or whether our concepts are clearly defined, we are engaging then in what the Beardsleys call philosophical questioning. So, philosophical questions are going to be highly general, right? The ordinary questions tend to be specific. They're about specific cases. You know, this person committed this crime and receives this punishment. You know, was that just? Whereas the philosophical question is going to be the more general, the more universal, the more fundamental question of, okay, what's the foundation of our notions of punishment, of crime and punishment, and what sort of underlying assumptions have to be in place for us to believe this? What are the conditions for the possibility of our ordinary beliefs? They address broad categories of phenomena rather than specific instances. You know, we're not dealing with particular things, particular examples. We're dealing with very broad categories. That's the high generality. Asking whether a particular crime deserves punishment is an ordinary question. Asking what justifies reward or punishment in general, is a philosophical question in the Beardsley sense. So philosophical questions are highly general, they're also highly fundamental. They concern the basic concepts and assumptions that structure and ground our entire worldview. So questions about particular facts are ordinary questions. Questions about the nature of knowledge itself are philosophical questions. So there's this sense of taking a step back from our ordinary beliefs, the things we take for granted, and asking, okay, well, why? It's the eternal 2-year-old's question, right? The 2-year-olds are all natural philosophers. Why? Why everything? Why is the sky blue? Why can't I have donuts for dinner? Philosophers do that just with everything. So basically the same as 2-year-olds then. So the process of critically examining our philosophical beliefs by asking philosophical questions is what the Beardsleys mean by philosophical thinking. So, and I'll say that again, the process of critically examining our philosophical beliefs, which are the general and fundamental underlying beliefs that structure our everyday practical beliefs, by asking philosophical questions, which are questions that interrogate the assumptions that stand behind and justify our normal practical beliefs. This is what philosophical thinking is to the Beardsleys. This is how they're going to systematize it. And this often requires confronting uncomfortable questions about the limitations of our knowledge, as well as the coherence of our most cherished beliefs. Philosophy is about pushing your questioning, the questions that you ask, the way you look at the world, pushing that out to the limits of what we can ask, how we can coherently understand the world. We're pushing against the very limits of knowledge with these questions in a lot of cases. And that can be uncomfortable, because that means questioning things that, first off, that we didn't even realize were assumptions. Things that we have taken for granted our whole life that have just become like a background, that we just assume, well, it's always been this way and everyone thinks that this is the case, therefore it must be true. The philosopher is going to say, no, that's not good enough. It's not good enough that everyone agrees with this. It's not good enough that the particular culture, the particular time, whatever, the particular family or institutional structure that you're born into affirms these claims. You need to be able to provide justifications, like real justifications, real reasoning. And we'll get more into what that looks like in Module 2. But you need to be able to provide arguments, solid arguments, for why we should accept these things, beyond just an appeal to authority or an appeal to culture. So, unlike mathematics or the natural sciences, philosophy does not offer a list of settled, definite truths. There are a lot of philosophy books out there. It's a 3,000-year-old discipline, and we're still debating the issues from the ones that were written 3,000 years ago. Those are still live topics. We're still debating the stuff that Plato and Socrates were debating. Because, again, these are questions that push up against the very limitations of human knowledge. And once we sort of arrive at, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to Russell, once we sort of arrive at definite answers, we're moving outside of the domain of philosophy then and moving into something like science or mathematics. So philosophy represents the sort of ongoing conversation that's been going on for thousands of years and across the globe, in which even our most fundamental assumptions, the basic sort of baseline beliefs that we operate on, remain always open to challenge and revision. They can always be updated. It's never final. You're never going to arrive at the final answer. And I think this is also true, frankly, for science. You never arrive at the final answer. There's always going to be update and revision that's possible in light of new reasoning and new evidence. So philosophical thinking aims to ensure that the concepts at the heart of our belief systems are clear, reasonable, and coherent. Philosophy promotes clarity by encouraging us to define our terms precisely. Conceptual analysis is going to be a big part of this. We want to avoid vagueness and ambiguity, weasel words, words that don't have clearly defined meanings, reasoning that's fuzzy. And we want to be able to express our ideas with meticulous care and precision and exactitude, and in a way that's persuasive and compelling. And this is one of the practical skills you get out of this, is the ability to really explain things and make your case in such a way that it is both persuasive and rigorous, logically sound. Your arguments are tight. You have looked at all the possible variables and you have set everything out in an airtight argument, and you can deliver it in a way that is hopefully both engaging and persuasive to your audience. So, and that requires challenging your beliefs to make sure that they're clear, that you are clear about what you believe before you try to explain it to someone else. Whether it's reasonable, where it stands on good justification, whether you have warrant for making your claims, whether you have good arguments for the things that you believe in, and whether they're coherent, whether they hang together, whether they support each other or contradict each other. And reasonableness demands that we provide good arguments for our beliefs. The philosopher doesn't just ask what we believe, but why we believe it, and whether our reasons can stand up to critical scrutiny. And philosophy cultivates consistency by revealing contradictions, unearthing contradictions within our belief systems. We want our beliefs to hold together, to support one another like threads within this interconnected web of belief. And any underlying contradictions that we find can threaten the entire foundations for ordinary beliefs and actions. So we want to critically interrogate our thinking and the thinking behind our thinking, to look for those weaknesses, to try to find the cracks so that we can fill them in. We're making a better foundation. It's like a house. You're trying to build a better foundation so that it can last, that it can survive the trials and challenges that it's going to face. You're trying to improve your ability to think about thinking. That's the Beardsley's conception of philosophy. And it's not, I think, a controversial one. I think it's a generally good schematic. And I think you can see it at work in Socrates and Russell. But we're going to move from the Beardsleys now, from their framework, to Socrates, who is basically the founding figure of the Western philosophical tradition. Imagine all caps with that, Western philosophical tradition, which is, as opposed to the various other philosophical traditions, the way of telling the story often in Western and Anglo-American universities comes across as if there is one philosophical tradition, which is the Western philosophical tradition, beginning with Socrates and Plato and extending forward through the modern period and then analytic philosophy and sort of arriving at where we're at now. There are many different schools of thought, many different traditions, certainly Eastern philosophy, Indian philosophy. There's a whole, we don't have time to get into all of that in this course. We're going to be doing the Western philosophical tradition for this course. So, but if you're interested, there's a whole universe of concepts out there. It's not all just Plato and Russell. So, who was the historical Socrates? So Socrates is like this definitive philosopher of the ancient Greek tradition. When we sort of think of ancient Greek philosophy, of the philosopher, we imagine the sort of bearded image of Socrates in his robes in the city of Athens, walking around asking questions to people and pondering things and being a sort of gadfly to the Athenian authorities. And this stands really at the heart of the Western tradition. This is like the origin of the story that we tell when we tell the story of the Western philosophical tradition. But unlike most significant philosophers, Socrates left behind no writings. We have no original writings or works of Socrates. We know of his ideas only because other people who knew him wrote about him. And we have a variety of often conflicting accounts. The majority of what we know of Socrates comes from his student Plato, guy you may have heard of, also a pretty famous Greek philosopher. Alfred North Whitehead, who was a famous philosopher of the early 20th century, described the Western tradition as all just footnotes to Plato. Like, it all starts with Plato and everyone else is just adding commentary to Plato. But the fact that we only know about Socrates through Plato's writing creates this sort of thorny question, which is known as the Socratic question, appropriately enough. How much of what is preserved in Plato's writing represents the thought of the real historical Socrates? How much of it is actually what Socrates thought? And there's some suspicion, particularly in Plato's later works, that Socrates is being used more as a character, more of a literary device to sort of convey, to spread, to propagandize, to propagate the mature philosophy of Plato himself. So there's always this tension. Is this what Plato thinks, or is this what Socrates thinks? And is Plato just using Socrates as a mouthpiece for these views? There's general scholarly agreement that the piece we're reading here in Module 1, which is called The Apology, usually it's anthologized as the defense of Socrates in the context book, but it's generally considered to be the closest approximation that we have to the actual thought and words of the actual historical Socrates. So this is as Socratic as it gets. And when we talk about Socrates, we often talk about method, the Socratic method. We meet this version of Socrates, this historical Socrates, arguing for his life before a jury of 500 Athenian citizens. The minor poet Meletus has accused Socrates of atheism and corrupting the youth with his teachings. And here, as in Plato's other dialogues, we find Socrates engaging in this form of systematic dialectical questioning, this question and answering that he's doing between him and an interlocutor, which just means a conversation partner, the person you're talking to. There's this conversational back and forth that happens that Plato uses, or that Socrates uses. That's part of his methodology. It's often called the elenchus, so I'm probably saying wrong because it's an ancient Greek word, or the Socratic method, which I'm hopefully saying more correctly. Socrates typically begins, and this is how this plays out, typically begins by asking his interlocutor, his conversation partner, to define some moral concept such as justice or courage or piety or virtue. What is justice? His interlocutor will say something about, it was just that so-and-so, which prompts Socrates to, well, when you say that this was just, what is justice? What do you mean by that? And inevitably, his interlocutor is going to respond with something like a specific example. Well, justice clearly is when this person did this thing, when this happened, and it was clearly an example of injustice when this other thing happened. And Socrates is like, no, that's not what I meant. That's not what I'm asking. Socrates is after something else. He isn't looking for an example of a virtue. He's not looking for an example of justice or courage or piety or whatever. He wants to know what it is that makes a deed virtuous. He doesn't want you to just list something that, a list of things that you think are good. He wants to know what makes them good, right? What makes something good or bad, right or wrong, virtuous or not, pious or impious, courageous or cowardly. What is it in virtue of which? And again, this is the Beardsley's question. What stands underneath it? What's the foundation that it rests upon? What general principle is at work behind the notion that this action was particularly or noteworthy in the sense that it was virtuous? What makes it virtuous? Why do we say that something is virtuous? And so this goes back and forth, and each answer is met with a further question that Socrates asks that is directed at the foundations of that answer. So, his interlocutor will come back with something. Socrates will ask a series of probing questions that are meant to kind of draw out the potential contradictions in that conception, and this will prompt a further response, and Socrates will again test that and challenge it and look for contradictions and try to get underneath. He's always trying to get underneath the idea. It's okay, well, in virtue of what? What arguments, what reasons, why do you hold this belief? What makes you think that this is the case? So, for each answer, he's met with further questions directed at its foundations, and the idea is to strip away layer after layer of unexamined belief to find something like the ground of virtue itself, the ground of justice itself, the sort of foundation, the ultimate foundation for this. So, the foundations of wisdom, that's what we're looking at. Socrates is charged by Meletus, the minor poet, with atheism. And Meletus is here acting on behalf of a number of other political interests in Athens. It's not just that Socrates annoyed this one poet. There are a lot of very powerful people who have an invested interest in getting Socrates off the playing field. He's causing problems in Athens with his questions. And because of the popularity, the sort of fan base he's gaining amongst the Athenian youth by going around and asking these questions. So one of the things they charge him with is atheism, and Socrates counters that charge by saying that not only is he not an atheist, but the whole reason that he's doing this is because of something that was supposedly said by the oracle at Delphi, who's a priestess of the Greek god Apollo. And what the oracle is alleged to have proclaimed is that Socrates was the wisest of all men. So there's this oracle in the city of Delphi, an oracle of Apollo, one of the Greek gods, who made a prophecy. Was asked, who is the wisest of all men? And answered that it is Socrates. And Socrates is like, well, that doesn't make any sense because I don't know anything. Socrates is very aware of his own ignorance. He's not, in his opinion, the wisest man at all. He's someone who has a lot of questions, not a lot of answers. So Socrates interprets this this prophecy from the oracle of Delphi as something like a divine command. He's on a mission from God now to find out what is this wisdom that he's supposed to hold. What is the nature of wisdom? If he's supposed to be the wisest man, in virtue of what is he the wisest man? What is it that makes him the wisest man? And how is he going to find this out? Well, he's going to go around and talk to other people who claim to be wise and try to find out what the nature of wisdom is. So this right here reveals kind of the first contradiction, and in a lot of Socrates' dialogues, he's going to be exposing contradictions in the position of the person that he's debating with. And the first contradiction for Meletus' charge of atheism is that Socrates isn't really, Meletus acknowledges that Socrates can't both at the same time be an atheist and yet believe that he is on a mission from God to discover the true nature of wisdom. You can't be both of those things at the same time. There's something contradictory about that. What is happening is that Socrates is not acknowledging the right source of gods, which in the case of the city of Athens would have been, Athena. The different cities in ancient Greece had different gods that were the god of the city. And Socrates is here following the wrong one, and he's doing it in the wrong way, by going around and asking lots of uncomfortable questions to people, rather than just accepting the received wisdom of the authorities of the city. And that's what's annoying to them about him, is he just won't stop questioning things. He won't just do and believe what they tell him to. So Socrates does believe in a god, but he doesn't it's a different conception. It's a deeper conception. It's it seems to be a well, more fundamental and more general conception of God than what is generally sort of argued for by the Athenian authorities and elites. So, to discover the truth of wisdom, excuse me, to discover the truth of wisdom, Socrates embarks upon a crusade to systematically interrogate all those who claim to be wise in the city of Athens, which means the politicians and the poets and the craftsmen. So basically all the people with power. His mission in life now, since the prophecy of the oracle, is to discover what wisdom is by engaging in this dialectical method with anyone who claims to be wise, anyone who claims to be an expert, someone who sort of promotes themselves as possessing profound knowledge. Well, he's going to be, okay, great, you are wise, you possess profound knowledge. Let's find out what that is. Let's find out what that looks like. Let's have a conversation about that. And this does not win him a lot of friends. At least among the people he's questioning. It does win him a lot of friends in the Athenian youth who are inspired by this, who enjoy watching Socrates sort of publicly going around and kind of embarrassing these pompous elites who, with their claims to, with their unfounded claims to knowledge and authority. And here's this guy who's just tearing them down, just exposing the contradictions in all of their claims. And he builds up this following. He builds up a fan base amongst the youth. And this does not make people in power very happy. So this is the origin of Meletus's charge that Socrates is corrupting the youth. By that he means that he is filling their head with a bunch of crazy ideas about how one should seek the foundations of truth and wisdom and virtue and that sort of thing, rather than just believing what the Athenian authorities tell you to believe, or following the sophists, who were sort of a prominent school within Athens at the time, and we'll talk about them in a second. So what Socrates discovers when he goes around asking the alleged wise men, the alleged experts, when he starts questioning them, he discovers a pattern of false wisdom, right? The politicians claim to have knowledge that they don't possess. The poets can't even explain the meaning of their own works. The craftsmen know some things, but the things they know don't generalize in the sort of way that satisfies the kind of wisdom that Socrates is looking for. So Socrates, from all of this, concludes that must be the secret to his own wisdom. That unlike the alleged experts of Athens, Socrates alone recognizes that he does not, in fact, know anything at all. Socrates' wisdom lies in his awareness of his own ignorance. And that's the key move here. That, only by acknowledging what we do not know can we begin the process of seeking true knowledge. We have to first recognize the limitations of our knowledge, or recognize that there are things that we don't know, in order to start genuinely, honestly questioning things. This principle is foundational to the Western tradition, the Western philosophical tradition, and it's a huge part of Socrates' enduring legacy. So against sophistry, who are the sophists? Socrates' habit of engaging in public acts of illicit philosophy put him at odds with both the local political elites and the people with power in Athens, and also a prominent school of Greek philosophy at the time known as sophistry. The sophists were professional teachers of rhetoric and argumentation. So they charged hefty fees, exorbitant fees, to offer instructions in the art of persuasive political speech. The idea was that the sons of Athenian leadership would be sent off to train with the sophists, where they would learn how to speak persuasively. It didn't matter if what they were saying was true, just that it was able to convince people, that it was able to persuade people to do things. And Socrates is entirely on the other side of this. He believes that what matters is whether or not your statements are actually true, whether they have the right sort of reasons and arguments and foundations. Not just that you're able to persuade people and that you can do this sort of lofty rhetoric. So this puts him at odds with the sophists. And the sophists are important to the political power structure of Athens because they are the philosophers, quote unquote, who train people how to do persuasive rhetorical political speech. They're the speech writers of the politicians of ancient Rome. They're the admin. They're the marketing executives. They are the ones in the background, the Machiavellian people who are teaching the leaders how to manipulate people, essentially. So for Socrates, philosophy should not be simply elevated rhetoric. He doesn't believe that. He stands against the moral relativism of the sophists. He instead insists on the objective reality of virtues, such as justice and wisdom and courage, which can get in the way sometimes of political persuasion. He charges no fees, while the sophists charge a lot of money to a lot of rich people in order to gain this power of persuasion. Socrates doesn't charge anyone any money. He founded no schools. He doesn't set up some sort of money-making scheme out of his philosophy. He lives it. It's a daily practice for him. It's just how he lives his life. So for him, philosophy is a daily routine of practical ethics. It's an ethical thing, and that's an important thing to realize. And one thing that makes Socrates stand out from a lot of other philosophers, both of his time and currently, is that the foundation is ultimately ethical. That he believes that what we should be searching for is figuring out what it means to live a good life. What does it mean to live a good life? What does that look like when we say the good life? And there's a Greek term for that, eudaimonia. It's often translated as human flourishing or the good life. What does that mean? In virtue of what is the good life a good life? So that is the sort of question that Socrates is going to be interested in. And it's not just this theoretical thing where you read about it in a book and it's like, oh, well, that's what the good life is. No, you have to go out and practice it. It's a practical ethics that you perform every day, again and again. You make it a habit. It's a lifestyle. There is no meaningful Socratic distinction between philosophical theory and practical ethical living. Now, Athens in the 5th century BCE, which is where all of this is happening, prided itself on being the sort of cradle of democracy and enlightenment. Yet it was also a democracy that was built upon slave labor, where intellectual freedom was constrained by religious orthodoxy, as we can see by Socrates being charged for atheism in this case, spuriously charged for atheism when he was simply following a religion that was considered unorthodox or heretical, and where politics were dominated by elite interests masquerading as democratic leaders. So, completely unlike any sort of political institutions that we have ever encountered, right? These are concerns that generalize, and I think for any system of power structures, you're going to have these contradictions, and they're going to make it uncomfortable for people to question these things. That's always going to make some people unhappy when someone comes along and starts asking questions that point out the contradictions at the root of the sort of power structures of society. And as Socrates' popularity grows with the youth, his philosophies begin to threaten to undermine these power structures. The people who have real influence and wealth within Athens, within Athenian culture, who determine the sort of direction of things and the way the conversation goes. And here's this one guy out there messing it all up by asking uncomfortable questions. Which leads to his trial and his execution, to the martyrdom of Socrates, which is where we find him in the Apology. So it's likely that the Athenian court expected to meet a contrite and apologetic Socrates, who's going to come in, with this sort of hat in his hand, and he's going to come before them, and he's going to recant all this heretical philosophy stuff and accept that a light sentence like banishment from the city of Athens, and accept it as mercy. Like, thank you for being so merciful for me. I promise I will stop asking all of these uncomfortable philosophical questions. That's what they expected. That's not what they got. They got a defiant Socrates who puts the entire power structure on trial. who comes in and puts Athens on trial. He flips the table on him. He turns the table on him. So, representing the city elite, the prosecution ultimately proposes death by poisoning. And the way these things worked is the prosecution would suggest a really harsh punishment, with the idea that the person who was on trial would then suggest something reasonable but more moderate, and then they would meet somewhere in the middle. It was like a negotiation. That they would open at opposite ends of the spectrum and meet somewhere in the middle. So, but Socrates doesn't do this. In fact, instead of it, he insists throughout the trial that he's done nothing wrong. He is following this mission that the oracle, this path that the oracle put him on to discover the nature of truth, justice, wisdom, all of these things. And he's not going to bargain for a milder sentence because he hasn't done anything wrong. In fact, he intentionally provokes the jury, suggesting that the appropriate punishment in this case should be to give him free meals at the state's expense. He's performing a service. He's helping them. He is helping to fix the soul of Athens. He is helping to uncover the contradictions so that they can have a better idea of the good, of the true, of the virtuous. He is being a public servant, and rather than being punished, he should be rewarded for it. The jury, who were, I think, before this point, kind of inclined to go for a lighter sentence, don't take this very well. They do not share this opinion that they should be thanking Socrates for questioning all of their most cherished beliefs. And as a result, he is sentenced to death. And in his final moments, Socrates declares that no evil can happen to a good man, either in life or after death. He's not scared of death. We shouldn't fear death because we don't know what death is. It could be a blessing for all we know. It could be a good thing. It could be like, this long, uninterrupted, restful sleep. It could be that we get to have conversations with all of the great thinkers of the past. It could be all of these things. We don't know. But what we do know is that it's shameful to abandon one's principles and allow one's soul to be corrupted by... in this case, by being untrue to himself, by being untrue to his principles, by being untrue to his philosophy and his mission from the oracle. That would be a fate worse than death. And that sets up Socrates' famous declaration, one of the most famous statements in all of philosophy and possibly in all of history, which is that the unexamined life is not worth living. If you're going to live in this world, if you're going to try to have anything like a good life, you're going to have to examine it. If you're not going to ask these questions, if you're not going to look for the foundations, if you're not going to look for what is driving you, right? For what or who, for what arguments and ideas stand in the background of your beliefs, if you're not going to question that sort of stuff, if you're not going to question what your beliefs actually rest on, then that's not a life that's worth living. And given the choice between death and giving up philosophy, giving up the pursuit of questions regarding the meaning and nature of existence, Socrates takes the hemlock. He says the unexamined life is not worth living. He swallows the poison hemlock, choosing death rather than sacrificing his ethical and philosophical principles. So, This sets up his legacy. The martyrdom of Socrates embodies one of the foundational sort of mythos of the Western tradition, which is that, here's a guy, he's awakened to the limitations of his own knowledge, right? He becomes aware of what he does not know, of how much he does not know. And that inspires him to stand resolute in his defense of this higher reasoning, that there has to be better answers, that there has to be more fundamental, more foundational, more general principles at work underneath the principles that we take for granted. And even against the mortal danger imposed by the entrenched power structures of his society, even under the threat of death, he holds on to this belief. He's willing to sacrifice his own life for his principles, for his principle, which is ultimately that you should seek knowledge, that you should critically interrogate your beliefs. So, by questioning those who claim specialized knowledge and by revealing the limitations of their understanding, Socrates undermines the epistemic authority that justifies the social status and political position of the power elites of Athens. And we'll talk about epistemology. Epistemology means the study of knowledge, and we'll talk about that more in Module 3. So, where traditional authorities demand deference to received opinion, Socrates insists upon subjecting all beliefs, especially the most fundamental and generally held, to continuous, rigorous examination. And that's what Socrates says philosophy is, which is not entirely unlike what the Beardsleys say, but also has a higher focus on an ethical dimension, right? The shift is away from just sort of abstractly trying to figure out what is the most general and fundamental principles that underlie our assumptions, and becomes an ethical imperative to try to live in such a way that you embody this quest for greater truth and greater knowledge, and ultimately for knowledge of the good, for what it means to live a good life. And that sets us up, I think, for Bertrand Russell and the analytic tradition, where we jump ahead 3,000 years. So we've looked at the Beardsleys' systematic framework for understanding philosophical thinking, and we've looked at Socrates' ethical practice of philosophical examination. Now let's turn to Bertrand Russell and his impassioned defense of philosophical rigor in the modern age. This really sets the tone for 20th century philosophy. Bertrand Russell, in the same way that Socrates stands as a foundational figure for ancient Greek philosophy, Bertrand Russell stands as this foundational figure for contemporary analytical philosophy. So, Russell's life. Who is this Bertrand Russell guy that I'm talking about? So, Russell stands as one of the towering figures of 20th century philosophy, a pioneering mathematician, logician, political activist. His work helped us establish the foundations of what would become known as analytic philosophy and contemporary mathematics and contemporary logic. He won a Nobel Prize. He was a prominent intellectual of his time who spoke on many things and was extremely influential in a lot of different areas. And like Socrates before him, Russell was a relentless critic of the dogmatic orthodoxies of his time. And like Socrates, he paid a price for this criticism. Russell was born into the British aristocracy in 1872. So we're into the 19th century here. He was initially educated under a regime of kind of strict conservative religious orthodoxy. But he starts pushing back on this pretty quick. His critical sort of approach leads him to challenge these foundations, and he ends up becoming this fierce critic of religious dogmatism, of conservative politics, and of traditional sexual morality. A lot of the things that you were not supposed to be critical of even then. So, like Socrates, Russell starts asking some uncomfortable questions of some powerful people. And this progressive stance would eventually lead to his dismissal from Cambridge University, where he served for a very long time. And it will twice result in his imprisonment, before it will eventually earn him the Nobel Prize for his humanitarian efforts and for his monumental contributions to mathematics and logic. So, they fire him from his job and they lock him up twice, and then at the end they give him a Nobel Prize. That's how it goes sometimes. He gets off better than Socrates. Russell's intellectual lineage runs through his collaboration with Alfred North Whitehead, who I mentioned previously. He's the guy who said that all Western philosophy is footnotes to Plato. Whitehead was a process philosopher, and with Russell, they co-wrote a book called the Principia Mathematica, which was groundbreaking for its time. It was an attempt to derive all of mathematics from logic. So the entire structure of mathematics, everything from arithmetic up to higher algebra, calculus, and trigonometry, etc., geometry, could, according to Russell and Whitehead, you could work all of this out by basing it on strict logical principles. If you could work out that logic, this is a position called logicism or logicism, which is one of the things Russell's associated with. In addition to being mentored by Whitehead, Russell then goes on to mentor Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was probably the most influential linguistic philosopher of the 20th century. And we're not really going to get into Whitehead or Wittgenstein in this course, but I'm just sort of situating Russell as someone who was both mentored by an incredibly influential guy and then passes that along to someone who perhaps becomes an even more influential person. And most of 20th century philosophy is in some sense responding to Wittgenstein, which is probably why we don't have time to really cover Wittgenstein in this course, because then it would just become a Wittgenstein course. So along with Wittgenstein, Russell's work would help to establish the foundations for modern analytic philosophy, with its focus on logical rigor, scientific evidence, and clear and precise argumentation. In his short essay on the value of philosophy from our readings, and this essay closes Russell's book, The Problems of Philosophy, and we're going to read a couple of other excerpts from that book in Module 3. It's a great book. It's a magisterial kind of overview, this huge, monumental overview of sort of the philosophical landscape of the time. I highly recommend that and Russell's History of Western Philosophy, which are both just hugely accessible and engaging and entertaining works of philosophy that describe the issues and the various players, and do so in a way that is logically rigorous but accessible, and also extremely witty. It's fun to read. His takedown of Nietzsche, who is a philosopher I like, Friedrich Nietzsche, but his takedown of Nietzsche in the History of Western Philosophy is like a thing of beauty. He just tears him apart. He doesn't like Plato either, for certain reasons. But anyway, in The Value of Philosophy, Russell addresses a criticism that dogged philosophy throughout its history, right? The philosophy, with its endless questions and lack of definite answers, doesn't offer a lot of practical value in a world that prizes concrete results and material progress. You know, it's a fast-paced work where we need to produce quantitative metrics demonstrating how we are maximizing our efficiency and what sort of value we're going to generate for our shareholders. Where does philosophy fit into that world? This critique comes from who Russell kind of ironically terms practical men, because in his sense they're not practical at all. He believes they're misunderstanding what practical means. But they usually portray themselves as being practical, the people who make this critique of philosophy, that it has no practical application to the material world and sort of the concrete results like science and mathematics do. And this critique assumes that knowledge is valuable only insofar as it produces tangible benefits, right? Technological innovations, economic advantages, solutions to specific problems. So what is the value of philosophy within this context? What practical value do you get from asking ambiguous questions about the nature of life, the universe, and everything? And Russell's response to this, characteristically, is subtle and profound. And he begins by noting a historical fact. It's often overlooked by the critics of philosophy, which is that many of the disciplines now considered paradigms of practical knowledge, like physics, chemistry, mathematics, and psychology, were originally parts of philosophical inquiry. They didn't break off and become their own discipline until later. They started out as part of philosophy. Philosophy is the mother of the sciences. What we now call natural science, in fact, was once known as natural philosophy. It was only when philosophers developed reliable methods for producing consistent results in these domains that they separated off from philosophy to become independent disciplines. So kind of everything starts off as philosophy. And once we begin refining our methods and developing ways to approach these questions that result in definite outcomes, that's when something breaks off and becomes its own discipline. And that, to Russell, is the point. The value of philosophy lies exactly in the fact that it pits our reasoning against the puzzles that science and related disciplines have not been able to successfully resolve. It asks the questions that science hasn't figured out, that mathematics can't answer. We are again pushing at the very limits of human thought here. We are asking for the most general, for the most fundamental, for the deepest understanding, and that is going to push us beyond any sort of list of sort of settled answers. And the ambiguity is part of what makes that valuable. The ambiguity and uncertainty of philosophical questions is, from Russell's perspective, it's a feature. It's not a bug. It's not a problem. It's the point. We inhabit a world filled with ambiguity and uncertainty, right? It's only by contemplating questions that resist straightforward answers that we can train our minds to navigate the complexities of the unknown and the precarious, that we have to deal with situations all the time that are actually ambiguous and uncertain, sometimes dangerous, precarious. And if the only way we know how to think is to sort of look up a definite answer to something in Google or Wikipedia or whatever, and we don't know how to critically engage with the interrogation of uncertainty, even profound uncertainty, even questions that may not be answerable. If we don't know how to do that, then we don't know how to navigate uncertainty and ambiguity in general. Then we are relying on authority rather than thinking critically. So for Russell, the value of philosophy resides not in the answers that it provides, but in the process of inquiry itself. It's the act of asking these questions that makes philosophy valuable, and how that teaches you to engage with the world. The questions of philosophy are often cosmic in their scale. They're questions that, again, push against the very limits of what we can understand. And they're labyrinthine in their complexity. They can be, in many cases, extremely complex and difficult and nuanced questions that philosophers wrestle with. They're these huge and complex problems that may, by their very nature, be beyond the capacity of human minds to ever resolve. They may be questions that we never get a satisfactory answer to, although the existence of science and physics and psychology suggests that occasionally we do get concrete answers to these questions, and new disciplines sprout up as a result of that, which is a practical result of philosophy. But the questions themselves, these sort of the enormity of the questions, by taking up the challenge of asking these questions, we're forced to sharpen our reasoning skills in ways that would be impossible if we were to concern ourselves only with matters that have already been settled and decided, stuff that already has answers. We want to ask these kind of questions that you can't just look up the answer to, right? We want to push against the limits of human knowledge because that's the way it expands. That's the way it enlarges. That's the way we learn new things. That's the way we create new disciplines. We're forced to clarify our concepts, to refine our terms with an increasing care and precision, to relentlessly critique our arguments, to avoid any flaws in our change of reasoning. There's constant self-critique that's going on. We're constantly looking for for cracks in that foundation. Again, if you're going to build the house of belief upon a solid foundation, you don't want it to have any cracks in it, and you're going to want to look for those cracks to try to expose them so you can fill them, and to ultimately engineer new and novel methods of investigation and conceptual analysis. We're trying to build our skills of critical analysis so we can build new methods, new ways of understanding. And Russell sees this as liberatory. Without philosophical criticism, our world would be bound by the settled dogmas of our time and place. Just whatever the people around you believe. Just whatever you can look up, whatever is going to be reflected back at you by your parents, by your institutions, by whatever authorities exist, by television, by the media. If you're not being critical, then you're just sort of you're speaking other people's words, right? Custom, bias, and tradition. These things would remain forever unquestioned, and whatever passed for common sense, the common sense of the practical man that Russell uses with scare quotes, would mark the boundaries, the eternal boundary of our imagination. We wouldn't be able to think outside of whatever was taken as common sense. Russell is very critical of the notion of common sense. There's the cliche that common sense is neither common nor sense. It's just what people around you happen to believe. That's what common sense is. It's the consensus. It's what has sort of become a habitual way of thought that structures your community, your epistemic community, your intellectual community. And if you're not willing to challenge that, to push against that, then you're trapped in it, and you can't get outside of it. There could, by definition, be nothing new under the sun if we did not challenge orthodoxies. There would be no progress towards any new frontiers of human thought or society. Everything comes from challenging what is considered, settled and decided and common sense. We have to ask these questions. It's precisely by confronting questions that resist easy answers that we expand our intellectual horizons and liberate ourselves from the confines of conventional thinking. Through the philosophical journey, through this journey of ceaseless critique, of constantly critiquing things, even to a level that often to non-philosophers may appear absurd or trivial. Like, it's just, at some point you gotta stop and accept something, right? You just stop asking all these questions. Just believe what the media is telling you, or what the authorities are telling you, or whatever particular power structure or social convention is telling you. But asking these questions is important. Engaging in this ceaseless critique is important. You have to, and of yourself too, you have to constantly critique your own thinking. And by doing so, you free yourselves from what Russell calls the tyranny of custom, which is the unexamined assumptions, biases, and habits of thought that constrain and that trap and that cage our thinking. This is a way to get outside of that, to adopt a broader and wider perspective. Philosophy, for Russell, is an act of intellectual and spiritual liberation. By escaping the limitations of our egocentric perspective and our cultural perspective, we are transformed. And this is a through line, I think, with Socrates too, of the practical value of philosophy lying in that it is a transformative act. As we contemplate universal questions, we inch ever closer to the truly objective and truly universal viewpoint. According to Russell, this is where the value lies, is by pressing against these questions, these universal, these cosmic, these huge, these general, these fundamental questions. We broaden our own horizons. We force ourselves to become greater to meet them. Our intellectual horizons expand. Our capacity for critical thought deepens, and our perspective widens to encompass more of reality. We become, in Russell's view, more fully human. So how does this apply to the concept of work? Because in our discussion, our Module 1 discussion, part of the way that's framed, there's an article that's linked that you should all read about the value of philosophy, its practical application in the workplace. And for Socrates, there's clearly going to be an emphasis on ethical value. But Russell is going to have a critique of the sort of the notions of the common sense of practical men, and of just accepting things unquestioningly. So, and this is going to be sort of his final answer to the practical men, that the social value of science and technology and these sorts of practical pursuits ultimately depends upon the reason and the imagination of the minds that produce and control that technology, right? If we don't have good minds in the background of our science and technology, then it's not going to be, well, first off, we're not going to produce any worthwhile science or technology, and it's not going to be used for good ends. And that brings Socrates' ethical concern back into it. It's not going to be directed towards the good life unless it is being controlled and driven and invented and produced by people who have the sort of critical engagement that involves asking questions about what is the nature of the good life. The production of a great society is dependent upon the production of great minds. The Athens of Socrates was able to achieve great things because its citizens were granted the leisure to spend their time in free contemplation rather than hard work. Now were they able to do that? That freedom for the city of Athens was purchased through the subjugation of conquered slaves. And Russell is thoroughly humanitarian, so he is not going to approve of that. But he does recognize that part of it is that people had the opportunity in ancient Greece to actually contemplate things, to actually have the freedom to consider, to contemplate, to really wrestle with these deep and fundamental problems. And if you're working, 24 hours a day, as many of us, I think, feel as though we are, then there isn't a lot of time to think about thinking, right? So how can a modern democratic society ensure that its citizens possess enough leisure time, enough downtime, to become not merely imaginative and philosophical, but also happy, moral, kind? How do you produce a society with those characteristics without providing some space for people to sort of step back and relax and contemplate deeper questions such as these? And Russell proposes one answer in his essay, In Praise of Idleness. And I'm going to offer that one within the context of the discussion module on work, because I think it directly sort of addresses Russell's perspective on the topic. So as technological progress improves, it improves production and it reduces scarcity. So scarcity is when you don't have enough of something. And Russell believed that by his time, industry and technology had already advanced sufficiently to produce enough stuff, produce more than enough stuff. It wasn't a problem of production, it was a problem of distribution. Fewer human labor hours should be required to meet societal demands as technology improves. This is what we've been sold all along, right? As automation, as technology improves, we're going to get all this free time. We're going to get our leisure back. We're going to be able to sit back and enjoy the robot butlers of the Jetsons and whatnot. We're going to have the Star Trek future with our holodecks and things like that. None of that happened. People are working just as many, if not more, hours. Productivity is through the roof, way more so than it was in Russell's time. We are producing more than we ever have, and we have automated more than we ever have. And yet we have seen no increase in human leisure, in human downtime, and rest. We're working harder. We're working longer hours, and getting less compensation for them, relatively speaking. So the problem to Russell's mind is not one of production. It's a problem of distribution, and it's an unequal distribution of leisure time. It's an unequal distribution of rest, essentially. The working classes perform the majority of the difficult labor, and yet receive the least amount of leisure, the least amount of downtime. While for the upper classes, the dynamic is reversed, right? I think this is not unlike what we see in our society. This inequality is justified by this appeal to the moral virtue, the moral value of hard work, which bestows all sorts of praise upon the essential workers. It's like you're making a noble sacrifice. You're an essential worker. You're doing this great work. Thank you for doing this great job. We're not going to cut your hours and we're not going to pay you more, but thank you. We're going to call you essential and we're going to give you compliments instead of giving you free time to think about all the reasons you should perhaps be critical of a system that thanks you rather than compensating you. The rich, meanwhile, are compensated for their lack of this virtue. They lack the virtue of this hardworking, industrious essentialness that our custodians and our care workers have. They can't claim that kind of virtue. But what they get instead is free time. They get a complimentary surplus of leisure. It's like you can point at them and say, these guys are lazy. They don't do anything. They just got a free ride because of who their parents are and who they know and their connections. It's not what you know, it's who you know. And they're like, yeah, you got us. We're not as virtuous as you essential workers, but that's okay because we got all the free time. So we're cool with that. We're perfectly fine with society in which you get complimented for sacrificing your free time in order to provide us with plenty of rest and leisure So free time becomes a luxury for the upper classes, is the idea, rather than a resource that should be available to all. If you're going to have a healthy society, it should be available to everyone. Everyone should have the time to actually be able to step back from things and think about our reasoning, about why we believe the things that we believe, and whether we're justified in believing in the things that we do. Keep people busy enough and they don't have time to question that. So contrary to the common sense view of practical men, once again, Russell insists that, quote, a great deal of harm is being done in the modern world by belief in the virtuousness of work. and that the road to happiness and prosperity lies in an organized diminution of work. He thinks there should be less work. He thinks our technology should be employed towards reducing the amount of hours people have to work, not reducing the amount of compensation they get, but reducing the amount of hours so that they have more time to actually engage in producing a society that is capable of critical thought. And this petition, Russell was saying this 100 years ago. You know, this anticipates a lot of the contemporary discussions we're having now surrounding the rise of technological automation, artificial intelligence, replacing jobs, reduction of the working week, even the possibilities of post-work and post-scarcity society, that at some point the AI is going to take all the jobs, everything's going to be automated, so everyone's going to be out of work. What do you do then? How do you structure society in that eventuality, right? There was a recent example in Germany that I found out about actually fairly recently while teaching this bit. A number of German companies completed a successful trial of an altered work schedule, which was a 4-day work week without any reduction in employee wages. It was what they called it the 180-100 concept. Their employees would retain 100% of their salaries while working only 80% of the time, but still contribute 100% of the output, of the productivity that they were producing before. And if you think about it, if you work 5/8 or 4/10 or whatever, you're not working that whole time. You maybe get 4 to 6 good hours out of somebody in a day. You're not getting 8 hours of work out of anybody in a day. You are not getting 40 hours of work out of someone in a week. You're not going to get a surplus of production by making people sit there for longer hours once they've hit their limit, right? So I'm going to close out this section by quoting Russell's closing argument for the diminution of work from this article in full. It's a short quote, but ordinary men and women having the opportunity of a happy life will become more kindly and less persecuting and less inclined to view others with suspicion. The taste for war will die out, partly for this reason and partly because it will involve long and severe work for all. Good nature is, of all moral qualities, the one that the world needs most. And good nature is the result of ease and security, not of a life of arduous struggle. Modern methods of production have given us the possibility of ease and security for all. We have chosen instead to have overwork for some and starvation for others. Hitherto, we have continued to be as energetic as we were before there were machines. In this we have been foolish, but there is no reason to go on being foolish forever. And with that, we're going to wrap this one up. Enjoy the existential comic in the transcript version of this, and I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.